So the BBC is currently in crisis. The Director General Tim Davie has resigned, following the leaking of the Prescott memo, an examination of their lack of impartiality and bias in their reporting, involving subjects like Donald Trump, war in the Middle East, and the way they present British history. So you might have thought that this wasn't the time to release yet another documentary full of self-loathing, portraying Britain's past as one long list of terrible sins committed against innocent people around the world. But common sense is like deodorant. Those who need it most never use it. And so they released Empire with David Olusoga. This is the BBC's latest documentary about the history of the British Empire, and this is just about everything you would expect it to be. An absolute diatribe, which when it comes to valuable historical content has about as much meat on the bones as Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo currently do. For those of you who don't know, David Olusoga is the very definition of a grievance peddler. The man is the absolute darling of the BBC and has made a career highlighting Britain's alleged historical wrongdoings, making sure to let the viewer know that they too bear the guilt of their ancestors, which they must atone for in the present day. Whilst even some of the most brilliant historians will never have a BBC show in their life, this third-rate activist has had multiple. In fact, he's had so many you might legitimately ask what he gets up to with the Director Generals when their wives aren't around. Allegedly. If you want an idea of where his perspective lies, it's worth knowing that despite only having a BA in history, he was called as an expert witness in the trial of the vandals who pulled down the statue of Edward Colston in 2020. He not only defended their actions, but even said he would have liked to have done it himself. Now, his latest documentary has certainly caused a stir, and much of the criticism is focused on his lack of historical credentials, as I mentioned, he only has an undergraduate degree in history. But I think this is unfair. As long as it's done well, the presenting of history can be done by anyone, regardless of how many letters they have in front of their name. And it's worth noting that some of the most stupid people I know and have encountered have PhDs. Take Professor Shelley Haley, the woman who notoriously said on a Netflix documentary that Cleopatra was black because her grandmother told her that she was. Or another professor, frequently on British television, Kehinde Andrews, who thinks that Africans were sailing to America before Christopher Columbus did. So it's not the number of qualifications that Olusoga has that's the problem, it's his blatant activism that he tries to disguise as history. Now, the series itself doesn't contain any blatant falsehoods, which, believe it or not, is a big improvement when it comes to the BBC. After all, this is the organisation that tried to convince kids that the term Anglo-Saxon was never used at the time, that there was a black Roman emperor, and that black women were disproportionately affected by the Black Death in medieval England. All 3 episodes are one long exercise in lying by omission. At no point does he seek to give the viewer proper historical context for the people and events that he's covering, instead choosing to portray everything in the most negative light imaginable, barely mentioning anything positive. But despite all this, the first episode actually starts quite well. He highlights how in 1592 English privateers captured the Portuguese ship the Madre de Dios. This mighty carrack carried the treasures of the East Indies. It had enormously valuable commodities like pepper, nutmeg, silks, calicos. The value of all these commodities from just one ship was staggering, totaling around half the annual trade of England at the time, creating a drive for the previously uninvolved English to set out for the East Indies to make their fortune and eventually found empires. Now, all of this is genuinely interesting and valuable, but in the end it's much like the scam involving 3 cups and a ball, where you have to guess which cup the ball is under. The scammers will allow you to win at first, building your hopes and your confidence in the future, only to trigger the scam and rob you of all your money and your dignity. And that's just what Olusoga does. He then moves on to North America, specifically Virginia, and the early conflicts between the English settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy. At this point, it would be worth mentioning that the native societies that the Europeans encountered had their own long history of warfare, conquest, enslavement, and political disputes. Barely any of the complexity of these 2 worlds colliding is covered. It is briefly mentioned that there were political disputes between the native tribes, meaning some would ally with the English against the other natives who they viewed as their enemies. However, this is completely drowned out by lengthy emotional interviews talking about the humiliation and the trauma that the native tribes suffered as a result of English conquest. He plays a similar trick when he goes to Barbados to discuss the lives of slaves on sugar plantations. Quick side note, he never actually mentions the word slave or slaves throughout the series, instead referring to them as the enslaved or enslaved Africans. Now, this obfuscating is very popular popular in academia at the moment, and is obviously associated with a certain political point of view. I don't think I need to tell you which one. Now, the conditions for slaves who worked on sugar plantations, whether in Barbados or anywhere else in the Caribbean, were undoubtedly appalling, far worse than for the slaves who worked with tobacco or cotton. And Olusoga goes into great detail as to how the slaves were mistreated, both in their whipping and mutilation by their masters, as well as the malnutrition they suffered whilst working on the plantations. And all of it is done in a highly emotional way, complete with sympathetic music in the background, and then he pulls his ultimate trick. Just take a listen.
And the discoveries made here are just one example of how the legacy of slavery lives on and continues to shape the lives of those descended from the enslaved.
When we think about what happened in Barbados as almost a petri dish for colonial endeavour, black bodies and people were violated for the maintenance and the growth of that wealth to the Western world.
There's so much wealth in this country from enslaved people. The fact that women would commit infanticide to not have children born into slavery, it's heartbreaking.
To actually buy and sell people like objects and then use them like animals, that requires the idea of race to make that all okay.
Slavery has been a very heavy burden for us as a people because you are carrying that burden all the time.
Feeling guilty yet? Well, he uses this technique throughout the series, conducting solemn interviews with the descendants of imperial subjects living in Britain today, reminding us that the bitterness in their hearts is alive and well. But it was when he discussed India that Olusoga truly exposed himself and the BBC. When discussing the dealings of the East India Company with India in the 17th century, he naturally highlights the rulers of the subcontinent at the time, the Mughals. After showing his clear disdain for the British Empire and all its actions, surely he'd have a similar story to tell about the Mughal Empire. After all, the Mughal conquest of India was marked by widespread bloodshed and was orders of magnitude more violent than the British conquest. The founder of the empire, who launched the initial invasion, Babur, was a warlord from Central Asia, descended from Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. He was known for building towers of skulls with the heads of his defeated enemies to intimidate his opponents. He declared himself a holy warrior and caused tens of thousands of deaths in brutal siege warfare. Then we have the Emperor Aurangzeb, who was in charge of the Mughal Empire at the height of its power. He was famously intolerant. He reintroduced the jizya tax against the non-Muslims of his empire and famously destroyed Hindu temples, leaving him a controversial figure to this very day. And even Akbar the Great, the late 16th century emperor, who is widely praised for his tolerance and competence, still carried out massacres, like when he captured the fort of Chittagong and tens of thousands of civilians inside the fort were slaughtered. Now, I bring these events up to show you that this is what it would look like if we gave no historical context to the Mughal Empire whatsoever, just like Olusoga does with the British Empire. So, he's a man of history. Surely he applies the same standards to the British as he does to the Mughals. Well, let's see what he's got to say.
And the residents of this fortress were the rulers of India, the Mughal emperors, the richest men on earth, with annual personal private incomes greater than the annual revenue of the whole English state. The wealth of the Mughals was in fact so legendary that even today it is imprinted onto the English language. Because when we use the word Mughal to describe somebody who is fabulously wealthy, that is an echo of the ways in which our 17th century ancestors marveled at the wealth of the men who ruled over the biggest economy on earth and their 150 million subjects from this fortress. The India of the Mughals became an economic and a military superpower.
Amazing royal courts, impressive architecture, the emperor sitting on an elegant throne. It would have been quite a scene for them to have.
Anyone detecting any bias or lack of impartiality? Suddenly, you're allowed to appreciate the achievements of an empire. And always trying to cynically connect history to the present day, he gets one of the young people who he interviews to effectively describe the Brits as third worlders who were marvelling before their betters when they met the Mughals.
It must have been bewildering. You can have a joke where if someone hasn't really grown up in a very developed part of the world, when they first come to a mall, they're really shocked by escalators. I can imagine it's very much the same happening in reverse.
When it comes to his treatment of Robert Clive, he doesn't quite use the standard lying by omission tactic. He even mentions Clive's brilliance in his ability to play the Game of Thrones of Bengal at that time. Whilst happy to go into great detail about stories of the empire that suit his narrative, he doesn't do this with Robert Clive, as to do so would undermine the narrative of his entire documentary. Robert Clive was a man who arrived in India as a clerk for the East India Company, but he stepped into the abyss and forged an empire. On the battlefield, his achievements were remarkable, winning a string of victories. He was called a heaven-born general, given his lack of formal military training. All of Clive's triumphs on the battlefield, including his seminal victory at the Battle of Plassey, were won with armies that were majority Indian, because Clive's great strength was his ability to work with his Indian allies. He gained the loyalty and admiration of his Indian sepoys, as he led from the front, shared their dangers, and made sure they were paid on time. And as mentioned, his political cunning was second to none. His ability to form alliances with Indians was a key reason why the East India Company came to be the ruler of Bengal. Olusoga even recruits a like-minded friend to discuss Robert Clive, the well-known historian William Dalrymple, a man whose attacks against British history in recent years have increased almost as much as his waistline has. And once again, he uses the young to make sure you know that the guilt for these actions in the past are very much alive and well with the younger generation today.
Today, the life of Robert Clive and the memory of what happened under company rule is better understood and more controversial than it has been for centuries.
That statue tells us a lot about Britain's self-image in the 21st century, how it's still really closely tied with empire.
And I find that very difficult. The way that we have sanitised history, that it's easier to turn everything inside out and put it on a plinth.
I think in reality, Clive's legacy is one of destruction and pillaging the subcontinent.
This is the full picture. I'm not asking you to be ashamed of it, but I am asking you to be aware of it. You do need to know it.
But by far the worst part of the series is when Olusoga goes to Africa, because it's on the continent that he proves to be his most biased and manipulative. He goes to Bunce Island in Sierra Leone, where once existed a slave fort, where African slaves were held before they were transported by the British to the New World. He carries out emotional interviews with African Americans who are visiting Sierra Leone, as they've been able to trace their ancestry back to this location. So you would think this would be the perfect time to mention probably the most important aspect of the Atlantic slave trade. Who was doing the enslaving? As anyone who has knowledge of this subject knows, that Africans enslaved other Africans in huge numbers and sold them to the Europeans. Entire kingdoms became enormously wealthy based on their capture and selling of slaves, whether it was the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Benin, or the Kingdom of Dahomey. For centuries, military campaigns were conducted which had none other than the purpose of enslaving other Africans to sell to the Europeans. The Atlantic slave trade was a joint enterprise. The Europeans were not strong enough to force the Africans to do anything. Both military weakness and disease meant that they were entirely reliant on their African partners for the purchasing of slaves. And Olusoga doesn't mention this once. And this is why the BBC will always pick third-rate historians like Olusoga and not seasoned scholars like John Thornton, a man who's extensively studied the African side of the Atlantic slave trade, the role that slavery had in African society, why these kingdoms were motivated to capture slaves, and most importantly, the fact that they knew exactly what they were doing, had ultimate agency over their actions, and enthusiastically took part in the selling of their fellow humans to the Europeans. At one point, Olusoga teases us, edges us if you will, making us believe we're about to receive some historical context, finally, telling us that the slave trading on Bunce Island was the result of a friendship between a Briton and, you think it might be an African, but no, it's another Briton. So that historical context, I'm afraid, never arrives. And then we come to the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery itself. Britain was the first major empire in the world to do this, and the importance of these events cannot be understated. They are seminal moments, not just in the history of Britain, but of mankind itself. The world's most powerful empire had abolished an institution that was millennia old. It had been practiced by almost every society on every continent throughout human history. From this moment on, Britain would use its great power to abolish this ancient practice all over the world, spending huge amounts of money on a fleet designed to force other nations to end the practice, regardless of how much they resisted. British blockades ranged from Africa to Brazil, and as the British Empire expanded territorially, each new land that was added to the empire, if slavery existed, it was then abolished. So does Olusoga conduct emotional interviews about these events? Or does he pull out archived sources, historical documents charting Britain's moral crusade against slavery? I think you know the answer to this. In a documentary that's 3 hours long, the entire discussion of the abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself lasts less than 30 seconds. The rest of the documentary follows the familiar pattern of lying by omission. Take the partition of India, for example. He's very keen to tell you that the whole process was rushed and chaotic, which it was. but he never mentions why partition happened. It might be worth letting the audience know that Britain initially opposed partition, but partition happened because the Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah absolutely insisted upon it, refusing to be part of a united India. His failure to mention this important historical context means that, complete with sad music in the background, when horrors of partition were discussed, like the killings, the displacements, all the onus is on the British Empire. The agency of the Muslims and the Sikhs and the Hindus is taken away entirely. And in what is now a familiar story, you have the interviews with the young people reminding you that amongst a certain generation, the grievance is alive and well. And in the final act of an insufferable series, he moves to the 1950s, where he enthusiastically tells you all about Britain's controversial actions in Kenya whilst fighting the Mau Mau. And of course, he makes no mention of the Mau Mau's brutality and no mention of the incredibly important fact that during the rebellion, more Kenyans fought for the British than fought in the Mau Mau. So to conclude, I would give it a 2 out of 10, maybe 2.5 if I was feeling generous. And I'm not giving it a 1 for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they didn't outright lie about anything, which I suppose is an improvement. Also, the first 20 minutes were genuinely interesting before it turned into an over 2-hour moral lecture about how we all need to feel guilt about our past. A huge thank you goes to my Patreon supporters. Their names are on the screen right now. There'll be a link in the description below if you'd like to join them and support the channel. Please like, subscribe, comment, tell me everything about the video that you liked, that you disliked. I want to hear it all. Maybe you agreed with me, maybe you agreed more with David Olusoga, maybe there's subjects that you thought I should have paid more attention to, as I couldn't cover everything in all 3 episodes of the documentary. Maybe you've got an opinion on the BBC and the direction that's gone in. Tell me that as well. Otherwise, until next time.